Hello. Yeah, so our last talk before lunch is Quintessence Anx, whose name I have a hard time pronouncing. Yeah, so let's welcome her to the stage.
Hello, everyone. How are we doing? Last talk before lunch. We excited? Yeah? Everybody hungry? I know we've been burning calories typing away down there. Been watching all of you not work while we're talking up here. Speaking of, since you've all been hunched over, I'm going to have everyone stand up for a second and just give a stretch. Release the tension in your shoulders. Side stretches are great. Don't hit your friends. And that's highly relevant because I'm talking today about what I'm calling sensory-friendly monitoring, which is how to not overwhelm yourself when you try and do something that looks a little bit like this. You might be working at a startup. You start needing to know things. You start needing to know more things. It gets very ugly very quickly, right? Especially if you have the weird startup scenario where you hired a contractor or something, and so you have a new product, but it's legacy too, like a car. So what ends up happening is you get a situation where you're still getting alerts and notifications via email or PagerDuty or whomever you prefer, but because you're getting so many of them, your brain is starting to turn what should be a notification that draws your attention into its own background noise. And so sometimes to get around this, you might find yourself muting notification sources. A common implementation of this is if you have a chat client. Slack gets picked on for this, right? Where you say, oh, I need to close Slack to get my work done. But if you don't have another way to get high priority notifications during the business hours, you've just turned off a whole source, which means that you have to wait to actually get the information that should have been immediate. On the flip side, you can just keep killing notification sources, but then you don't trust your quiet, right? Because once it's quiet, it's not necessarily quiet because it should be, it's quiet because you forced it to be. And that's less than ideal for everyone, because then you wind up, unfortunately, a bit like Target and some of the other talks we had this morning. And that's unhappy. So we want to find a good, happy place to be where we're getting the notifications we need to, but without getting all the extra noise with it. And why we care about that, I'm going to take a quick detour about what noise does to us. So your brain is always processing information. Here's a question. How many of you have ever lived with another human being? Parents, spouses, siblings? Cool. How many of them have had an obsessive interest in something? How many of you have found yourself to be an expert in that something despite never cracking a book on it yourself? Background noise is noise. Your brain is making effort in absorbing that information. So when those alerts and those high priority items that are frequent and maybe not, and your brain is trying to interpret all that information, it's still distracting you. It's not distracting you the way you maybe intended it to distract you, but it's still taking up cognitive energy. How much cognitive energy? So here's a somewhat scary statistic. So Gloria Mark did a study at UC Irvine, and basically she did what were called repetitive tasks and then did an interruption study. And it was basically to see how long it took people in the study to course correct for an interruption. And to be clear, this wasn't an interruption that diverted them entirely. This is more like Joe developer walking up to you and saying, hey, what's the Wi-Fi password? And then walking away, and you're just like, but my Kubernetes. It's a 25-minute recovery period because you're going back to the state you were in before you were asked a question, even if it's a short one. So you're rebuilding wherever you were at in the mental model or the bug that you were trying to fix. And in order to get back there and try and reset, it takes an average of 25 minutes per interruption. So when you think about how we're working in a lot of open office environments, some of us, or even at home where maybe there's the occasional spouse, roommate, or whatever your situation is, these little interruptions do crop up kind of sporadically throughout the day, right? And they're heavy in cost cumulatively. So you might think, okay, that's fine. So I'm going to try and get through it anyway, right? So another study, why not, There was a study that was done that was actually testing AP students and interrupting them kind of in a similar way that Gloria was doing in her study to see what the cost in their score was. So this was in the writing portion. And for those unfamiliar, AP scores are 0 to 5. And when they were interrupted, they had a half-point drop. So that half a point is actually pretty significant percentile-wise. And so then they did a follow-up study to see if they could get that back if they gave them back the half an hour. And they did not. So not only are you not truly able to recover, even if you add time to your day or you work overtime or whatever you're trying to do to get that back, you actually can't truly get it back. And the quality drops. And then we need aggressive QA and things like that in order to make up for it, because otherwise things will slip through the cracks just by the nature of working with other humans, right? Because you can't not be interrupted ever. Next stage might be to think, okay, so if I can't be interrupted, I'm going to learn how to multitask. And human brains are terrible at multitasking. And so Michigan State did a study. Michigan State? They did a study about multitasking, and they had them do a highly repetitive, simple task. Think Bart Simpson writing lines. It wasn't, but it could be. So writing lines repetitively, and then they tried to interrupt them to see how many errors would appear in the simple line that they were repeating. And it actually doubled their error rate. So that's not ideal. So if you think you can multitask, even with simple tasks, you're going to have a hard time. But engineering isn't simple. That's why we have to have a ton of talks and research materials and books and websites dedicated to how difficult it is, right? There are a lot of different components. There are a lot of different teams. There are a lot of different specialties all trying to work together. And multitasking really just hurts us all. So really the best thing we can do is reduce the noise. But how? So the first thing you need to be aware of is that awareness is key to not being overwhelmed, right? So if you find that you have a lot of notifications or you have a lot of emails or however you're sending things through your system, you can actually start to categorize them a few different ways. You can categorize them by like service or deployment or staging versus prod. Do I need alerts for the system, et cetera, et cetera. But then once you do all of that, you can start to make workflows, right? Am I, the person working on AWS, getting notifications that actually impact someone who needs to know about JavaScript in the front end? Because if I'm getting that notification, I'm ignoring it or forwarding it off depending on the size of the team and if I know who to forward it to. And once you have all of that done, you can actually create a routine around these workflows to make sure that they stay clean and efficient. And as a simple example, I say simple, but you can see how much overlap there is, even in this tiny environment where you have maybe Jira or Elastic or whatever you prefer. You might have AWS or GCP, again, or whatever you prefer, version control, chat, email, notifications, and everybody's just chattering away at each other, right? And you, the human, are setting this up and making this happen, but you need to. You can't not let these services talk to each other. And this is, again, very simple, but those arrows are already all over the place. But speaking of you, another important thing to be aware of is that sometimes you create your own noise for yourself. Who checks their email during the workday? You're not that tired. Who checks their email during the workday? Yeah. Anybody check Slack or Flowdoc or whatever, right? Including the ones that aren't your work channels. Right. You might get text messages on your phone. The alerts might show up on your home screen. So even if you ignore your phone, you have to put it upside down, which might make you sporadically do this maneuver. Who does that? Yeah. So as you keep going through all of these daily notifications, your social media is distracting you. Your own life is distracting you, right? And there are ways of getting around this too. Two-prong approach, work and home social life. You need to set communication boundaries around the notifications that are coming in at you, right? Because it's not just about, Facebook, Twitter, whatever, Instagram, notifying you on your phone. It's also about coworkers, Joe asking the Wi-Fi password. And if you don't tell people that you need them to not bother you for the next hour or whatever, they're not going to know to take these low priority requests to someone else, right? Because hypothetically, I'm going to keep picking on the Wi-Fi password, because why not? Hypothetically, you are not the only person in your organization that knows something like that, right? They could ask almost anybody. So if you're asking not to be bothered, they can know to ask one of the other people. And this is important. if you set a time every day where you're like, okay, these are when I tend to have meetings, these are when I tend to be interrupt busy, you can actually try and direct your interruption traffic and say, okay, 10 to 2 is my dedicated working time. Please do not interrupt me with low priority requests during that time. And you can also specify what low priority is, and that will vary from your job description to what you're working on at the time. But once people know what low priority is, they can reroute those requests. And the same goes for spouses too, or roommates or whomever. If they're sending you messages to pick up the milk at noon, you're not going to get to it to 5 anyway. Ask them to just message you 10 minutes before you're out, unless somebody's in the hospital or whatever your threshold is, right? You establish the threshold, and then they can only address those requests as needed. But going back to, DevOpsy things and things that are relevant to our actual workday, some of the more base categories for noise sources are false positives and negatives. For example, when things fire when maybe they ought not or do not when they should, and such things like that. This can happen especially if you have revisions in your code and your modding system has not been kept updated in pace, which is a frequent issue. If you have a fragile system, it might be very noisy, for example, and this goes back to the legacy systems. Whoever has worked on a legacy system, you know that sometimes things get a bit chattier than you would ideally prefer. And if something is sending things out frequently, you can just fix it, but you do have to prioritize when you're going to fix it. And if it's not being fixed soon and you're getting a lot of extra chatter from it, you need to adjust how you're getting those notifications so that a true emergency is what you get the notification over and not something where it's just sending out info messages. While you're doing all of that, you need to quantify where it needs to go. Back to the earlier example of I'm working in the cloud infrastructure and I'm getting notifications on the front end, it's not helpful. In a startup where everyone tends to be jack of all trades, it doesn't matter so much. I mean, it does and it doesn't in the sense that if we're all in the same space, I can usually redirect it myself. That's extra work for me and not ideal, but it's fixable. But let's say you're working at a large company with teams of engineers that are not in the same office or same time zone, or however large your enterprise infrastructure is. You might not know how to fix it. So if I'm getting a wrong notification in that example, I don't even know where it's supposed to go, and I cannot redress it. So make sure that everything goes where it needs to go. It's best to start when you're small, because then you can catch it and it grows with you. You need to make sure that it's only notifying you as noisily as it should, which goes to the last 2 points about making sure that it's going to the right people and with the right noise level. And what do I mean by that? So here's a really relevant example. One time in AWS land, I was notified at 4 a.m. on my phone about the database using too little memory. So that was an excellent phone call to receive at 4 a.m. Who likes getting those? Anyone? No? Yeah. So I go up the next morning, and this was part of startup culture, right? When everybody shares everything, someone else can hypothetically wake you up, which is what happened. Someone else wanted to be really assertive and do good things, and he said he sat down and calculated, if all the services are using the database, they shouldn't be using less than this. So it means there's a problem. I'm like, or we could alert on errors. And he's like, oh yeah. And so we fixed it. But in an ideal world, I shouldn't be able to be woken up by something that someone else notices or perceives. We should be having a conversation, but then I should be making the alert. Because then we could have had that conversation in advance where he would say, hey, I had this idea, and we could talk through it and actually find a better way to alert on the infrastructure side, right? That made sense. Because there wasn't an outage. I was woken up because apparently a service was using less than he thought it should be. But everything was up, running, and fine. So to avoid being woken up at odd hours when you don't actually want to be woken up at odd hours, make sure you're communicating and making sure that people are responsible for their own pathways to success. And for all this talk about keeping everything streamlined, it is important to have flexibility and redundancy. So how many people use, we'll say Slack? Slack? Okay, good. We'll click on them a little. So Slack's great. Right? A lot of things plug into it. You might have notifications, hopefully going to a dedicated channel so it's not overcoming like general or something. But you might have things piping into Slack. So let's say Slack has an outage. If you don't have a way to redirect those alerts, your alert system has an outage, even if it's up and running fine. And it doesn't matter who you're using. If you're piping it to one endpoint and you don't have the ability to flex around that endpoint, you're stuck with it. You can at least direct to email depending on who you're using, right? Usually. But ideally, you want to make sure that you can flex away, and you also want to make sure you're reevaluating your tools. So we pick on Slack because they're big and most people use them, but they're also generally highly available. It is rare for them to actually have a true outage for multiple hours that can take down your business day. But if they or any other tool you're using does start to regularly have outages that last business days and cost money and hurt the business and just negatively impact your ability to do releases and other things that you need to keep your infrastructure up and running, then you need to reevaluate that tool. You might need to switch, you might need to change your implementation, but you do need to make sure that your tools are not out, or else you're going to start relying on human notifications, which means if and when someone who's using your service notices there's a problem, which is one of the slowest methods of notification ever. Once you start having more resilient noise, you can start to trust your noise. So instead of being anxious Squidward when you have silence in your system, you can actually use it to focus. Because if there's silence and you're not sure there should be, you're going to be hypervigilant, right? You're going to be looking. You might be actually opening up whatever dashboards or panels that you have set up to see if it's actually fine or if it's just silently failing. Anybody here have a fear of silent failure? Half? Do the other half of you have really good monitoring? But realistically, though, you work with each other, you work with your vendors, or if you're using an open source product, you find some way to make sure that your notifications and your monitoring system is actually functional, because you don't want to be taken down by a third-party tool. And then once you have the trust, and you know that the silent is trustworthy, you can actually do your work and maybe not be hypervigilant. But last important note about that, making sure that you keep reevaluating it. So sometimes you introduce a new tool and you have to do a massive overhaul for that, and you have to make sure that it aligns with your actual business needs and your code base and all that stuff. But it's not always like that. Once you have that tool in place, most likely you're just updating it. Unless you're not, which means you're going to, at some later point in the future, implement that same overhead cost that you had to introduce a new setup to basically introduce a new setup, because your code base has changed so much that all of the surrounding ecosystems are no longer in sync, right? It's easy to do it, or easier, I should say, to do it if you do it either regularly, like with sprints or however you move along with your regular meetings, but it's also important to do it every time something triggers. Just do a quick little incident on it. Maybe you say, oh, we really don't need that anymore, and we can delete this notification or this metric or this, what we're watching over here. Or maybe you can say, oh, actually, this is triggering all the time, going back to an earlier slide. But as you keep those alerts clean, then that saves you from having to do, for example, an annual or biannual, where you're reconfiguring the whole system, which is going to just take everybody's time. And the worse it gets, the harder you're going to be able to negotiate time in terms of a department to actually address the issue, which is going to kind of feed itself into anarchy. So make sure that you're keeping up with it and making sure that keeps everything in sync with each other. If anyone would like to do some additional reading, I do have resources up on my slide prezo deck, which is also available at this link. Link is still on this slide, by the way. And that is how you keep the alerts down in your system. If you have any further questions, my name is Quintessence. I also go by keyword Quinn because I know it's a mouthful. And I work at App Dynamics, and we're the table right by the monitor when you walk through the doorway there. So if you want to ask me anything now, that's fine. But if you want to find me later, I'm in blue. Thank you.